Vortex, Ethnopolitics edition. I am Margiro Kartsonaki.
And I'm Stefan Wolf. In today's edition, we are talking to George Kyris, who is an associate professor in international politics at the University of Birmingham, and also the founding chair of the ECPR, Statehood, Sovereignty and Conflict Research Network. Welcome to our podcast, George.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Excellent, thank you. In the latest edition of Ethnopolitics, we published an article of yours on the recognition of the right to statehood in Palestine. This could hardly be a more topical issue, so I have to caveat today's episode by saying that we're recording this in the morning of 14th November 2025. As it is often the case with the Middle East and with Donald Trump in the White House, events can move faster than we account for them on our podcast. But before we dive into this, can you tell our listeners a bit more about how you became interested in the issue of the recognition of states?
Sure. So my interest in the topic of recognition in international relations actually began with a very specific case, as it often happens. So during my PhD degree many years ago, I focused on the role of the European Union in the Cyprus conflict, and particularly in relation to northern Cyprus, where the Turkish Cypriots have declared a state that remains unrecognized by the international community. So that case really sparked my curiosity about the broader dynamics of recognition. Why are some declarations of independence recognized? Why others are not recognized? And from there I became more interested in how international organizations like the European Union or the United Nations engage with questions of recognition. I've come to realize through my research that recognition isn't always black and white. It's not simply about being recognized or not being recognized. There are different degrees of recognition, and I think this we're discussing today really speaks to that nuance, because it looks at the recognition of a right to statehood as a type of recognition that may not be as good as full diplomatic recognition, but is definitely better than not being recognized at all. And this is a position that is often expressed through international organizations and carries some political and symbolic significance.
What I was struck by was that you ask in your article the question of how does the recognition of a right to statehood matter? And you draw on several examples, such as East Timor, South Sudan, and Kosovo. And you also note that recognizing a right to statehood often is a first and critical step for the international community to begin a process of state building, which, at least in some cases, ends with the creation and crucially recognition of actual states. Does that seem to be a viable path for Palestine?
So that does seem to be the $1 million question at the moment, whether a Palestinian state is possible. I think one thing to remember here is that for the past 20 years or so, there has actually been a lot of international state building activity aiming to create conditions for Palestinian state. So, for example, the Palestinian Authority that now represents the Palestinians is the outcome of such state building. But overall, state building in Palestine has not been particularly successful. And this doesn't create a lot of optimism that new efforts at state building, for example, on the basis of the Trump plan, would have better results. But I think what we need to remember is that Palestinians achieving statehood has to be possible because there is no other scenario that will do justice to the rights of the Palestinians. One of the points that I elaborate in the article is that having a state is not the only way through which self-determination can be achieved, but there are situations where, for a variety of reasons, statehood is seen as the only way to satisfy self-determination, and Palestine is perhaps the clearest case of this situation. So even if at this moment Palestinian statehood might seem distant or difficult to realize, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is the only fair endpoint for the Palestinians. It is also the only endpoint that will offer security for the people of Israel. So then the challenge is to ensure that what may not seem viable today becomes viable in the future. So I think any future state building must try to avoid pitfalls of the past.
I think excellent points. Thank you very much for this. So in your paper, you also mentioned the internal dimensions of statehood, so the ability to effectively rule a territory and a population. In the case of Palestine, this is more complicated because we also have the non-contiguity of territory and the internal divisions between the different Palestinian factions in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So what would effective rule of territory and population look like in Palestine? And are we referring to one single Palestinian state comprising both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank under the governance of a unified authority, which also raises the question of where would this unified authority as an administration be based? Two independent Palestinian territories governed separately but as part of the same state.
These are really important points. I think one thing to say first is that there are experts that are more qualified than myself when it comes to the practicalities of state building on the ground, because my own research focuses more on the diplomacy of statehood. But these are issues that are very deeply connected, interconnected. So I do have some thoughts. At the moment, and for a very long time, the most widely accepted framework by both the Palestinian leadership and international players for resolving this conflict is the two-state solution, which calls for a Palestinian state where both the West Bank and Gaza are governed by a unified authority. This reflects a very typical traditional understanding of what state, a single centralized government exercising control over territory. But in the Palestinian case, this has not been easy. You rightly point out the internal divisions among Palestinian factions as one of the reasons why. But this is only one part of the challenge. So the Israeli occupation has also played a major role in undermining the continuity of Palestinian authority, even within the seemingly one territorial unit of the West Bank. So even if there is a unified Palestinian authority, I don't think this will by itself guarantee a fully functioning sovereign state. And now on the question of whether there are alternatives to this two-state solution, I think what is important is that any solution, first of all, respects the wishes of the Palestinians and allows them to exercise their rights to sovereignty. How that happens in practice is complex, and the realities on the ground, some of which we discussed for a long time, have pushed many academics, policymakers, many Palestinians as well, to think outside of the box of the typical state. And there are many models that have been considered. If I may, I would like to mention an earlier issue of ethnopolitics that explored innovative approaches for Palestinian self-determination, some within the two-state solution framework and others beyond it. This is the 2016 Ethnopolitics special issue on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's been 10 years, but I think in many ways it remains an important point of reference.
I want to go back a step to something that you said earlier, which also connects to the answer that you just gave to Oyura, and that's the point that it's one issue to think about self-determination for Palestinians, and it's another issue of how this idea of self-determination can be manifested in reality. So in the conclusion of your article, you say that the recognition of a right to statehood is the acknowledgement from international actors, often collectively and at large bodies like the United Nations, that the self-determination of a group of people can or must be met through independent statehood. So as this constitutes intent or aspiration, I think it's very difficult to disagree with it. But in reality, if we look at a case like South Sudan that you also mentioned in passing in your article, South Sudan has been ravaged by a succession of very vicious, violent conflicts almost from the very beginning of its existence as an independent state in 2011. So, I mean, how much self-determination the people of South Sudan actually gained as a result of the international recognition of their state. So, in other words, is there something missing more generally between recognition and self-determination that actually makes it worthwhile for the people who ultimately should benefit from that?
Thanks, Stefan. You know, as fellow researchers, you might relate to what I'm going to say, which is that one of the most difficult moments in our work is when you realize that something we study because we believe it's important turns out to have very little impact in practice. And this is how sometimes I feel about recognition in international relations. So the example of South Sudan that you mentioned, Stefan, that's of course very interesting in that respect. South Sudan is a state that has achieved full recognition on paper self-determination, but despite this, it continues to face conflict, governance challenges, and this is also despite a lot of investment from the international community in state building. So I think what this tells us is that recognition has its limits. It doesn't automatically translate into meaningful self-determination or statehood. Again, I think Palestine is a case in point in this. For years there have been broad recognition of the Palestinian right to statehood, but this hasn't brought much closer the actual ability of the Palestinians to independently govern their territories. Another example that I know both of you are interested in is Western Sahara. For decades, the international community acknowledged independence as a legitimate possibility for meeting the self-determination for the people of Western Sahara. But then more recently, this position seems to have shifted, and now autonomy within Morocco being discussed as the way to resolve the conflict. So I think there is often a very long and difficult road between having your right to self-determination recognized and actually achieving statehood. And even when statehood is formally attained, like in the case of South Sudan, it doesn't necessarily guarantee peace, security, or prosperity. And again, going back to the topic of this article, I think these issues actually raise a lot of questions about what might lie ahead for the Palestinians and whether international recognition and international state building alone can truly deliver sovereignty for the Palestinians.
So on the issue of state and institution building, I have to say that I was surprised to see South Sudan being mentioned as an example of a case that built the institutions of the state, given its institutional weakness. But second, and more to the point here, Gaza needs first and foremost physical reconstruction, the extent of the destruction. And I have two interrelated questions here. First, how realistic is it to speak about state and institution building in the face of such a lack of basic infrastructure? So both public infrastructure and private in roads and public buildings. And who is going to pay for this infrastructure, reconstruction and state building?
I mean, a serious surprise that after decades of international state building efforts in places like South Sudan or Palestine, we have seen so little in terms of actual stability or institutional resilience. I think this really underscores the limitations of international state building. In the case of Palestine, the challenges are huge. Having a functioning state, especially after the Gaza war, isn't something that Palestinians can achieve on their own. And I think the international community, whether it's the United Nations, the European Union, or states like the UK, they have a responsibility to support the Palestinian people in building and rebuilding their state. But I think it's also crucial that we reflect on what hasn't worked. So much of what is being proposed now, so building institutions, infrastructure, isn't new. So these efforts have been going on for decades, and yet the results have been very limited. So then the question is, what can we learn from past failures? And I think one key lesson is that you simply cannot build a viable state under conditions of occupation and annexation. So many of the recent statements in support of Palestinian statehood have been framed as a response to the growing annexation of land by Israel. But although these statements are important symbolically, we also have to wonder whether they can be translated into meaningful action. and I think this is a much harder question. The current power dynamics in the region, but also reality more globally, make this a very difficult task. But I think if governments, if international organizations are serious about supporting Palestinian statehood, they need to confront these obstacles head on, and they need to rethink how they design and how they deliver support in a way which is different to what has happened before and which clearly hasn't worked.
Just picking up on this last point that you made about the broader regional context, if we look at the geopolitical environment in which the Palestinian question is embedded, it's hard to see this purely in terms of self-determination of Palestinians and their right to an independent state, especially after the attacks by Hamas on October 7th in 2023 and then the subsequent war waged by Israel in Gaza. Now, you make the very important point, in my view, in your article that when it comes to ending the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and I quote you here, any possible settlement formulas must honor the clear and unwavering commitment of the international community that Palestinian self-determination must be met through sovereign statehood. Now, do you think that there is enough consensus in the region and beyond to agree on such a formula and make it work? And sort of as a subsidiary to that, what do you think this formula could look like, and what would it require to be successful?
So a quick answer would be that yes, I do think there is a growing global consensus, and it is a consensus that Palestinians not only deserve a state, but in many ways already have a state. So one of the big developments since the article was published over a year ago is that we have seen many more countries recognizing Palestine as a state. So this means that countries that do not recognize Palestine are increasingly in the minority and therefore isolated as well. So allow me some numbers here. Today, it's less than 20% of UN members that do not recognize Palestine as a state. And the United States is the only permanent member of the UN Security Council that hasn't recognized Palestinian statehood. I think that on paper, international support for the Palestinian cause, and I think it's important to remember that many of these new recognitions that came in the past few months were also driven by strong public pressure towards these governments. But although this consensus on the recognition of Palestine is important, I think we have to be realistic about its limitations. So, for example, the United States might be isolated, but it does remain a key ally of Israel. And the current Israeli government is openly opposed to Palestinian statehood. So that creates a major obstacle to Palestinians achieving their full statehood. I think for this to work, a reversal of many of the policies that the current Israeli government is pursuing and which continue to undermine Palestinian statehood. And I'm afraid to say that I don't think recognition statements alone will make a difference. I think the irony is that many states declared that they recognize Palestine in a way highlighted that they are doing very little about Palestinian statehood.
Many thanks, George, for such an interesting discussion. It's really an exceptional good start to our podcast series.
Yes, thank you very much, George, and many thanks also to all our listeners. We hope you enjoyed this first episode of Navigating the Vortex Ethnopolitics edition. George's article on the recognition of a right to statehood in Palestine has been published open access in issue 5 of volume 24 of Ethnopolitics, and you can find a link to it in the show notes.
You will also be able to read the full written version of our conversation with George Kyris on our website. You can register for free at navigatingthevortex.com. Signing up to the newsletter is the best way to make sure you don't miss out on anything. And you'll get the future episodes delivered straight to your inbox wherever you are in the world.
We hope you'll share Navigating the Vortex Ethnopolitics edition with anyone you might think would find it of interest. If you like the show, please consider rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are listening. Until next time, it's goodbye from all of us here in Birmingham.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.